pressure. And it's important to say that when you look at this little presentation, you also have to remember that I've given you notes which you also need to look at to do your second piece of work for me, which is the report. Brilliant. So, let's kind of have a look at two really important words that we need to consider when we're talking about blood pressure. Systolic and diastolic, or diastolic and diastolic. Okay? Two words. The way I always remember it, guys, is this. S, the systolic or diastole, literally means S for squeeze. In other words, the heart is contracting, and we now have established which chamber in the heart was it that was contracting to produce this high pressure reading? The left ventricle. I'm just going to put LV, left ventricle. The left ventricle is contracting and it is pushing blood out of the heart. Where would you normally take blood pressure from? Your arm. During diastole, or your diastolic blood pressure, is when your cardiac muscle in the left ventricle is relaxing. In other words, it is in between beats. So effectively, left ventricle contracts, boom, pressure goes through the roof, you measure that high pressure in an artery, normally in your arm, boom. When the left ventricle relaxes, blood pressure drops to its lower value, that is in between heartbeats. In other words, that left ventricle is filling, it is no longer squeezing. Normally, this gives us a blood pressure reading of two numbers, a higher number and a lower number. And in general, and don't anybody start freaking about this because this is kind of a statistical thing, blood pressure normally is expressed almost like a fraction. So for example, the high number, 120, is your diastolic blood pressure when your left ventricle is contracting. The lower number, 80, is the pressure in your artery when the left ventricle is not beating. So you can kind of see it goes higher and then it drops, but it doesn't go to 0. So it's 120 and 80, 120 and 80. Okay, two higher numbers. The convention is, guys, and it is still the convention that we use today, is that we measure this pressure in what we call millimeters of mercury, and the chemical symbol for mercury is Hg. So normally, if you're doing blood pressures, you would say, I've taken the person's blood pressure, and we do get lazy, and we say, it's 120 over 80. But the units of blood pressure are millimeters of mercury. So just remember that at the end, millimeters of mercury.
My old boss actually corrected herself from having a heart attack because she took blood pressure. Because obviously she worked in care homes, it was kind of one of those like, oh, let's see what our blood pressure is.
Yeah.
Hers was like really high, so she actually drove herself to the hospital, and it turns out she was half an hour away from having a heart attack.
You see, it's not just me that talks death. Even the students are talking about death. But she's fine.
She's fine. She didn't have a heart attack. They've got an issue to prevent it. But it was just
just a point to add, high blood pressure and low blood pressure are equally problematic. In our country, we tend to focus on high blood pressure as being problematic, and we kind of associate high blood pressure with things like cardiovascular disease and strokes, for example. But equally, low blood pressure is also problematic as well.
Last time I checked, I had blood pressure of like 144. So no, okay. Because I was working in Walls, I need to go to doctors and stuff.
No. We'll see in a minute some of the figures where you start to get into more dangerous ranges. Okay. So, nice slide again, but it's only telling you what you already now know. When the heart is filling, is blood pressure at its lowest or its highest? Lowest. So this is diastolic. In other words, it is filling, the ventricle is not squeezing, therefore blood pressure is lower. On this side, the ventricle, especially the left ventricle, is squeezing blood out of the artery, right the way around your body. This is when blood pressure is at its highest. So when this is pumping out, that's when you get the 120. When it's relaxing, that's when you get the pressure of 80. Simple so far, guys? Pretty simple? Okay. It's better than the ECG, though. Okay. Again, just emphasising that fact again. Remembering, please, one important fact. We don't get any pulse in a vein. So even when we're measuring blood pressure, you'll also notice in the handout I ask you and tell you where you can take a pulse from as well. When you are feeling a pulse, what you are feeling is an artery. When you are feeling a pulse, what you are feeling is the high blood pressure pumping through that artery. Never ever take a pulse with your thumbs. Anybody know why?
You've got a pulse in your thumb.
Because you've got a pulse in your thumb, mate, like you know. It's like harmony over here. It's like a little choirette going on in the corner. You have a pulse in your thumb. So if you're taking your pulse, normally you would use these two fingers and you would apply slight pressure over where an artery is closest to the surface of the skin. The favourite is here. It could be here. It could be here. Where else could it be? Anybody know where else you might take a pulse from? You can take it from your groin, your femoral artery. You can also take it from your foot. You can take it from, if you are on your ankle, near where your ankle is, just there you've got a blood pressure, an artery that's close to the surface, you can feel it there as well. Why do you think it's kind of important?
On the inside or the outside of the ankle?
Inside. If you we're doing it now, aren't we? If we think about it, why do you think it might be important to check a pulse in various parts of the body? Feels on it. You said it. Blockages.
No, I know she said that.
You said it. Blockages. Especially when you get to lower limbs. Because sometimes people that have got type 2 diabetes, for example, do not have good circulation in their feet, which means they can develop ulcers if they get a cut. Okay? So it's important we can take a pulse from various parts of the body. But what you're actually feeling, guys, what you're actually feeling is, in reality, you are feeling your left ventricle squeezing blood into your hand. That's what you're actually feeling when you take a pulse. Super. Now, this is just the guide before people start going, geez, I am pre-hypertensive. Your statistical, students at the back, blood pressure has just literally gone up. Okay. Statistically speaking, your normal range is round about 120, and it's normally less than 80. Statistically speaking, I guarantee if we took blood pressure now from people, we'd get very few people who are 120 over 80. Mine would be significantly high because I'm stood up and I'm moving around. A lot of people will probably fall into that range, which is what we call pre-hypertension. In other words, you've not got high blood pressure, but it's showing indications that you might. And then we get into three ranges of high blood pressure. The one that we are most concerned about, obviously, is this bottom one, which is called hypertensive crisis. If your blood pressure is higher than 180 and your diastolic pressure is higher than 110, your blood pressure is capable now of doing damage. Which blood vessels can't stand high pressure?
Capillaries.
Thank you. Capillaries. Why? Because they are only
One cell.
Gee, we have learnt biology. So what do you think high blood pressure will do to your capillaries? High blood pressure is a killer because it will pop capillaries in your brain, in your kidneys, all over the place, in your lungs, and you will, this is the last time I'm going to say it today, you will not be with us because you will have a stroke, or you will have a pulmonary embolism, or you will have renal failure. It's not great news. That's why we're always really concerned about high blood pressure, but equally, if your blood pressure is too low, you are not pumping enough blood to your lungs, you're not pumping enough blood to your heart, you're not pumping enough blood to your capillaries in your kidneys, so you won't even be filtering out all the waste products in your blood. So no matter which way we go, high blood pressure and low blood pressure, at their extremes, are not good for us.
So what's low blood pressure? It's not on there.
I've always concentrated on high. I've always concentrated on high.
Low beyond 120.
But if you are less than this, then you are going lower and lower and lower.
So at what point does low blood pressure become dangerous?
I'd have to look that one up. Again, I'd have to look that one up. I'm not sure at what point it becomes significantly dangerous. Normally we associate low blood pressure with a lack of blood volume. So I know, for example, that we go into what's called hypo, low, volemic volume shock if we lose around about 2.5 pints of blood.
I've got really
You've got low blood pressure. It's not bad.
That's why I paint a lot.
But so if you stand up quickly, do you go?
Yeah, overall. Can you treat low blood pressure
Yes.
easier than you can treat high?
You can treat both low and high by altering the diameter of the arteries and also, if necessary, keeping the rate of your heart beats. So there are medications that you can take. Simple.
Got it.
Simple.
Every
Everything else that you need to know about blood pressure is in the handouts, so I've given those to you as well, in the handouts that you've got. And it talks about things like pulse pressure, it talks about white coat hypertension, it talks about where to take a pulse from. These are the things that you need to consider putting into your report. But I think that you're quite capable of absorbing that information, not from me, but from what you read. However, if anybody wants to come back to me, Faye, on anything that's in them, then we'll do that in our next